A chilling morning in rural Oregon. The sun had barely begun to wash the horizon with soft gray light when John Miller eased the battered door of his farmhouse shut behind him, hands already tinged with the chill of early April. The little town of Elmtown, tucked against the shoulder of Oregon's rolling Cascade foothills, still slept beneath the hush of morning fog. John's boots crunched over gravel as he crossed the porch, the sort of sound you didn't notice until you were alone with it. A sound, he thought, that seemed almost too loud on mornings like this. John was not a man prone to superstition, despite living most of his 60 years on this stretch of farmland at the edge of the forest. The dense woods that sprawled around Elmtown were woven into the lives of everyone here, their shadows falling long across field and fence post. Deer prints and fox tracks were common sights after a night's rainfall, and the people learned to respect the land's wild, secret ways. For John, the forest was more than just a neighbor. It was an old companion, ever-changing yet trustworthy in its rhythms, except perhaps on mornings like this one. He carried with him a battered canvas bag and his favorite mushrooming spade, a stubby, well-worn tool his father had once used, the kind that never left a man's side when rambling into the underbrush. Mushroom hunting had always been John's favorite spring ritual, a solitary dance with the earth when conditions were right. This year, the ground seemed particularly inviting. A mix of cool nights and light rain had left the soil dark and mushy, prime territory for morels and porcini. Normally, he'd stick to the trails most traveled, old logging roads and deer paths he knew by heart. But this morning, as the wind shifted and brought with it a whiff of wet cedar and humus, John found himself making for a part of the forest he'd generally avoided. The Miller Hill Cemetery, long abandoned, sat on a rise, surrounded by moss-laden oaks. Folks in Elmtown whispered about that hill, saying it wasn't wise to wander there. Some claimed the dead lay restless, others mumbled about old secrets. John figured that was just talk. Still, with fewer people nosing around the overgrown headstones, the morels might be thick. As he made his way past the split-rail fence dividing his backyard from the wild, the world felt muffled, cushioned under a layer of dew. The only sounds were the steady thump of his boots and the distant call of a mourning dove. 3 solemn notes, repeated over and over. John looped around a patch of blackberry brambles, swatting at fresh shoots that snagged at his jeans, and entered the woods. Within moments the air cooled further, filtered by ranks of Douglas fir, and light receded until everything was a dappled palette of shadowy greens. 20 minutes into his walk, John's focus had narrowed to the ground, his eyes flicking from clump to clump, searching out the distinctive honeycomb heads of wild morels poking through flattened grass. He found a cluster near the base of a fallen birch and was carefully slicing them loose when an acrid, unnatural smell made him pause. It was the sort of smell that crept in slowly, like a memory you'd hope to forget, until suddenly it overwhelmed everything else. John straightened, his nostrils flaring as he turned into the wind. It wasn't just rot. No, it was heavier, metallic, sweet, and nauseating. At first he wondered if a deer had gotten tangled in a snare, or if one of Elmtown's resident coyotes had dragged something off to nest in the brush. Sometimes animals got themselves into trouble, and it wasn't unusual to stumble across a carcass half hidden beneath last autumn's leaves. But this was different. This was wrong. Heart knocking a little faster, John set his bag down. Should he turn back? He'd heard those old rumors. Kids daring each other to spend the night among the tombstones, tales of midnight bonfires and shadowy figures flickering just out of sight. Most nights, that would be enough to keep any rational person away. But John was a practical man. If there was a dead animal near, it could draw predators to the edge of his property, and nobody wanted to wake up to a black bear rummaging through their bins. Better check it out, he told himself. Just a quick look. Steeling his nerve, he moved forward, pushing aside overgrown huckleberry bushes and trying not to slip in the mud. The stink grew stronger, curling around his senses, forcing him to fight back the urge to gag. He stalled when the woods thinned, giving way to the gravestones of Miller Hill Cemetery, older than anyone now living, their marble faces dulled by decades of rain. Lichen crawled up the crumbling monuments. Wildflowers grew unchecked in the cracks between stones. His eyes caught a patch, a shallow mound at the edge of a little rise. The ground there looked fresher, the earth churned up as though a late frost or unwelcome visitor had been through. One simple granite marker stood crooked, the name Linda Evans barely legible through the filmy moss. Someone had left withered poinsettias on the grave. A child's toy truck, plastic faded to pink, lay upended beside it. Drawn despite himself, John moved closer, each step unsettling as the smell thickened. The cemetery felt strangely alive, a hush that pressed in on his eardrums. Somewhere back near the woods, a blue jay shrieked. He shivered and knelt, feeling the soil. It was loose, faintly moist, and the color didn't quite match the older heaps. He unclipped his mushroom spade from his belt. "This ain't nothing, John," he half whispered. "A habit picked up after too many years on your own." With a little trepidation, he pried at a corner, pulling up a hunk of earth, expecting, hoping, maybe a dead raccoon, judging by the stench and flies. His breath caught as the earth shifted, revealing something pale and waxy, just beneath the surface. A shape like a finger, delicate, human, unmistakable, jutted up crooked between the clods of soil. At that moment, the chill in the air felt arctic. John scrambled back, the spade slipping from his grip, boots skidding in the muck. Dread worked its way up his spine, bitter and sharp. He clutched at a nearby tombstone to steady himself, breath coming fast. All the stories, all the superstitions, crashed through his memory in a tidal wave. For a moment, it seemed like the trees themselves leaned closer. John grabbed his bag and bolted, not even bothering to collect the mushrooms he'd worked so long to find. He could feel his heart hammering, fear chasing him down old trails, branches clawing at his jacket as he ran. By the time he burst free from the trees into the open pastures of Elmtown, light had finally broken over the horizon. There were other shapes now, roof lines, pickup trucks glinting in the distance, the world solid and real in a way the cemetery could never be. John stumbled up the dusty road toward the general store and dialed 911 with trembling hands, the details of the morning etched into his mind like scars. He would later recount the story to Sheriff George Hayes, his morning ritual interrupted by a brush with the unimaginable. But in those first frantic minutes, John Miller was just a simple Oregon farmer, caught between the ordinary and the unspeakable, delivering news that would shake his quiet community to its core. The gruesome discovery at Linda Evans's grave word travels fast in small American towns, and Elmtown was no exception. By the time Sheriff George Hayes' patrol car rolled onto the single-lane gravel road that wound up Miller Hill, a few locals had already gathered near the gate of the cemetery, drawn by rumors and a shared uneasy curiosity. John Miller, still pale and visibly shaken, waited beneath the limbs of a spreading oak, jacketed against a wind that felt sharper now, colored by dread. Sheriff Hayes was a big, careful man in his late 50s, known for handling county business with a calm hand. He took in the scene with a practiced eye. The muddy tracks where John's boots had scuffed the ground, the patch of disturbed soil near the Evans headstone, and the gathering crowd kept respectfully at bay by a single rookie deputy. John stammered out his story, voice trembling only slightly as he recounted the sickly odor, the strange mark of freshly dug earth, and the unmistakable glimpse of a human finger breaching the soil. Hayes' face hardened, not with disbelief, but with grim confirmation. He'd seen the worst that rural Oregon could offer, but something in the way John described that patch of ground raised goosebumps all the same. "All right, everybody. "Back up to the road. Nobody crosses this line," he commanded, setting up a makeshift perimeter with yellow crime scene tape. The rookie deputy stayed put, nervous but attentive. "John, where exactly was it? Show me." Together, they returned to the edge of the gravesite. The stench hanging over the dirt was undeniable now, and even the birds had abandoned the branches overhead. Hayes motioned for John to stay clear. He'd already seen more in one morning than anyone had a right to. Pulling on latex gloves, the sheriff crouched at the disturbed spot. Carefully, he brushed soil aside, noticing at once how different this patch looked compared to the time-worn graves nearby. The old ground was thick and clotted, spongy from years of rain, while the fresh mound broke apart with just a little pressure. He saw first what looked like a scrap of pale, wrinkled flesh, too clean, too recent to belong to anything but a human. Breathing shallowly, Hayes revealed a severed knuckle, then a whole finger, the skin swollen and tinged a grayish pink. The fingernail was intact, painted a chipped shade of blush pink. A woman's hand. His mind leaped ahead. This wasn't a reburial. Someone had buried a new body here, atop Linda Evans's old grave. Within 15 minutes, the county coroner, Dr. Susan Carter, and a pair of deputies arrived, sirens silenced out of respect. Susan, who'd handled far more than her share of grisly scenes, quickly surveyed the area. They marked the boundaries, documented everything. The angle of the grave, the placement of the finger, the subtle impressions of what looked like tire tracks at the cemetery's rear. She directed the team in the painstaking work of exhumation, the low thud of shovels underlaid by the murmured prayers of a neighbor watching from afar. As dirt gave way, more of the body appeared. A forearm, clothed in the same gray fabric John thought he'd caught a glimpse of earlier. Strands of long black hair coiled in the loam, and worst of all, the unmistakable outline of a woman's face, mouth frozen in a final, silent cry. The air was thick with a sickening, sweet rot, an aroma that clung to everyone, making eyes water and stomachs lurch. Even the most hardened among them turned aside when Susan, hand steady, uncovered the right hand and found the second, all too precise, injury. The absence of the pointer finger hacked away at the joint. The cut was ragged, no surgeon's hand, but a desperate, callous attempt to erase something. Susan glanced at Sheriff Hayes, her tone clipped. Time of death? Within the last 72 hours, from the look of it. There's not enough decomp to put her here any longer. Hayes nodded, running through the mental calculus of means, motive, and opportunity. Whoever this woman was, she'd died recently, and she hadn't died gently. The examination continued. The grave wasn't deep, barely enough to conceal a body, making it likely the burial had happened in haste under the cover of night. The authorities photographed every step, cataloging the dirt on her clothes, the position in which she'd been dumped, face up, arms splayed, like a grotesque marionette. The actual Evans, coffin lay untouched beneath. This wasn't grave robbery, Hayes realized. Someone had chosen this grave to conceal a fresh crime, overlaying new sorrow atop old. Questions multiplied in the gathering morning. Who was the dead woman? What had brought her, or her killer, to this lonely hill? Was the perpetrator someone local, familiar with the isolation of Miller Hill Cemetery? Or was this an unlucky accident, a hiding place chosen at random? And what, if anything, did she have to do with Linda Evans, whose grave had lain quiet for a year? By mid-morning, the local crime lab arrived in a van bristling with equipment. They swabbed for DNA and took samples of every possible trace: hair, fibers, flecks of soil that didn't match the surroundings, cigarette butts stamped into the mud by a tense hand. Notes were made on everything. Recent rain had softened the ground, making it easy both to dig and to leave behind accidental clues. Sheriff Hayes instructed his team to lock down the scene and begin the process, slow, methodical, and unrelenting, of canvassing for missing persons reports and talking to every soul in a 10-mile radius who might have heard or seen something, anything, out of the ordinary. All the while, John Miller sat on the tailgate of a pickup truck, hands clenched, eyes fixed on the spot where his routine morning had turned into a nightmare. The story of a simple farmer who became the unwitting witness to a secret nobody in Elmtown could fathom. All across the little town, phones were ringing. Coffee grew cold on kitchen counters as neighbors peered anxiously through curtains, wondering what evil had been unearthed from the shadowed soil of Miller Hill. Crime scene examination and the launch of the investigation. The sun had climbed a little higher by the time the forensics team from Marion County rolled up to the Miller Hill Cemetery, greeted by the twang of distant blue jays and the muttered prayers of onlookers kept at bay behind the police tape. The somber buzz of walkie-talkies and the distant hiss of static filled the air as Sheriff George Hayes supervised, his stance firm, his gaze flickering between the anxious faces of his team and the freshly unearthed grave. Detective Laura Bennett, a sharp-eyed investigator with a reputation for catching details others might miss, took command of the site log. She directed the stamping of muddy boot prints, the labeling of evidence markers, and the careful logging of everyone within 100 yards. Every person who set foot near Linda Evans's grave would be accounted for. Laura had an intuition for this kind of case, messy, layered, and packed with secrets. She could smell it in the silence between the chirps of the radios. The team worked with practiced precision. The medical examiner, Dr. Carter, coordinated the exhumation, gently lifting the remains of the young woman out of her hasty, shallow grave. Layers of dirt were bagged and tagged separately. One never knew if a clue, a stray hair, a fiber, even a bug, might change the course of the case. "You doing okay, Sue?" Laura asked, pausing as Dr. Carter wiped her brow, the mask of professionalism uncracked despite the grave's ghastly offering. "I've seen worse," Susan replied, though her eyes told a different story. "But this feels personal. Whoever did this wanted her to be hidden, wanted her forgotten." Sheriff Hayes called everyone together for a quick debrief near the coroner's van. "I want pictures, dozens and dozens. One lens here, one on the tire tracks at the edge. Get me casts before the weather turns that mud to soup. And someone get a shot of the wildflowers. They look recently trampled." The evidence collection proceeded methodically. Detective Bennett knelt by the slot where a car's tires had compressed the grass. A few inches away, she found it, a cigarette butt, half buried, its faded filter branded with a brand she hadn't seen much since her rookie days. Sunset Menthols, a cheap brand, hardly ever stocked at local stores these days. She slipped it into a bag with gloved hands and jotted a note. The killer had been nervous, possibly waiting for someone or pausing to reconsider. Over by the fence, Deputy Bill Mason snapped photos of errant footprints, at least 3 different sets, leading to and away from the grave. Some overlapped, some fresh. A larger print, heavy-soled work boots, likely John's, but smaller ones too. Could they belong to the perpetrator, or maybe a confidant, an unknowing accomplice? Bill nodded at Laura and moved to swab a patch of mud for possible DNA. Rain had made the earth sticky, clinging to shoes and under fingernails. Meanwhile, Sheriff Hayes took another walk around the perimeter. On the northwest side, where the cemetery faded into denser underbrush, he found a torn piece of plastic, shiny and black. Looked like the corner of a garbage bag. It was an ordinary item, but out of place here, in the wild grass and century-old tombstones. He gestured to Laura. "Bag this and have the lab test for blood or fluids." Inside the coroner's tent, the woman's body was carefully examined. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Long black hair, wearing a wrinkled gray blouse and dark jeans, the kind sold by every department store in the state. Her shoes were missing. The most glaring injury was, of course, the missing pointer finger. Dr. Carter noted jagged, almost hesitant cuts. It looked like an attempt to remove a key identifying feature. Maybe she had a scar or tattoo, something distinctive. The victim's face was battered, but not beyond recognition, at least not if someone had seen her alive recently. A key element nagged at the investigators. Who would go to the trouble of burying a victim atop an existing grave? Not an amateur. Someone who knew the old cemetery wasn't watched, who maybe even had local ties or memories of the place. Hayes walked back to the gate and eyed the empty parking area, just a few deep ruts where the grass wouldn't recover for weeks. He made a mental note. Check the town's hardware stores and local supply shops for recent shovel or tarp purchases. As the afternoon drew on, every piece of evidence was boxed up and logged. The cigarette, the torn plastic, the soil samples, the stray black hair found on a rose bush 15 feet from the grave. A swab of dried blood had been found on the base of an oak, likely transferred there by someone's gloved hand or a panicked stumble. Laura began interviews with witnesses, starting with John Miller. His account was detailed and unwavering. He described the smell, the unease, how he'd seen the weird patch of earth that didn't match the rest. He remembered, too, that as he hurried back to town, he'd passed an unfamiliar pickup idling outside the road to the cemetery, though he couldn't remember make or model through the morning panic. In Elmtown, word had spread quickly. Calls poured into the sheriff's office, rumors of strangers seen in the area, a fight heard near the cemetery 2 nights prior, a farmer from 5 miles east reporting tire tracks crossing his field. Most leads would go nowhere, but Detective Bennett insisted each one be logged and checked for overlaps. Back in the evidence room, Laura and Hayes pored over photos and maps. Where had the victim come from? There were no missing persons in Elmtown fitting her description. Was she from Seattle? Portland? Someone just passing through or caught in a struggle that brought her here? Laura requested facial reconstruction workups and distributed the victim's description to every agency in the state. Evening settled over Miller Hill, and the investigators gathered at the scene, exhaustion settling into their bones. Sheriff Hayes stood for a moment in the deepening gloom. He had an uneasy feeling. Cases like this rarely stayed simple. There were ghosts on Miller Hill now, and not all of them belonged to the people buried beneath the stones. With the scene secured, the forensics van loaded up the last of the evidence. Hayes locked his cruiser and cast a long look back at the Evans grave, now an open wound in the old cemetery's skin. The hunt had begun. Whoever had chosen Miller Hill as their dumping ground thought their secret safe amid the crumbling monuments and wild Oregon woods. But those woods, Hayes knew, had eyes, and in time, secrets always found their way into daylight. The young woman's identity and the cabin in the woods. 2 days after the grisly discovery on Miller Hill, Elmtown had transformed. What was once a sleepy backwater now throbbed with a disturbed energy. It seemed everyone in town was either glued to their radio, peering through curtains toward the distant tree line, or swapping stories at the corner diner about who might have been foolish or desperate enough to bury a body in the old cemetery. Down at the sheriff's office, phones rang, so constantly that even the receptionist wore a headset and tracked details in a battered notepad. Each call was logged, each rumor weighed. Most led nowhere. Old grudges, kids sneaking around, folks letting their imaginations get loose in the shadow of real horror. But then, in the early afternoon, a different kind of call came in. A young woman named Julia Nguyen, breathless and anxious, drove up from Salem to speak in person with Detective Laura Bennett. Julia's friend and roommate, Lisa Tran, had vanished. "She hasn't come home, hasn't called," Julia explained, fingers twisting her purse strap. "She's not like this. She always checks in." As Julia spoke, an icy dread grew in Laura's gut. The description matched the victim. Asian American, late 20s, shoulder-length black hair, 32 inches tall, about 110 pounds, last seen wearing dark jeans and a gray blouse, right down to tiny details, like a birthmark on her collarbone. Lisa was between jobs. She'd been working at Pacific Trails Travel, but the company was cutting staff. I think it's possible she was meeting someone. A friend, maybe an old boyfriend. But she never said she was having trouble. Detective Bennett listened carefully to every word. Julia mentioned that Lisa had left their apartment in Salem in the very early morning of April 6th, saying only that she was going to sort something out in the nearby town of Elmtown, a place neither of them had ever even visited before. Meanwhile, the medical examiner ran Lisa's dental records and fingerprints against state and national databases. When Julia provided Lisa's hairbrush and toothbrush, it allowed the lab to fast-track a DNA match. Within hours, they had confirmation. The young woman buried atop Linda Evans's grave was Lisa Tran. The grief that hit Julia, sharp, wordless, rippled outwards. The sense of loss was amplified, not just for Julia, but the entire team of investigators. This was no nameless drifter. Lisa Tran had loved ones, a future, a face. She had not simply vanished into the endless Pacific Northwest forest. Someone had taken extraordinary risks to erase her existence. The question, why Elmtown, now pressed harder. The answer came, as so many do in small towns, from an old-timer with a sharp eye and a liking for coffee. Mabel Walker, who ran the gas station out on Route 22, called in after hearing Lisa's photo was shown on local TV. Morning of April 6th, I saw a young Asian girl hanging around the pumps, Mabel told Deputy Mason. She looked nervous, checking her phone over and over. A man drove up, a real plain pickup, Washington plates, tinted windows. She got in without hesitation, and they drove off toward Miller Hill. Mabel apologized, but couldn't recall the truck's make or license plate. Still, the timeline matched exactly. Detective Bennett and Sheriff Hayes pored over local traffic camera footage, but the road to Miller Hill was notorious for its blind spots and thick brush. Even so, they did spot a silver pickup headed out that direction around the right time. While the trail of Lisa's last moments narrowed, a parallel track was opening. 15 miles west of Miller Hill, in a pocket of rundown forest owned by the state, a fire crew stumbled onto an old hunting cabin. Its door was ajar, windows shattered. The place reeked of mildew, mouse droppings, and something sickly sweet underneath. The cabin, once rented during deer season, had been abandoned for years. No electricity, no running water, just ramshackle planks and rusted hinges. The firemen, curious but cautious, peeked inside. Instantly, they noticed the dark stains that crawled across the warped wooden floor. They radioed it in. Detective Bennett, accompanied by the forensic team, arrived at the scene that evening under pelting rain. The team examined the site under harsh LED beams, each surface scoured for signs of recent occupancy. In one corner, a sizable swatch of blood had soaked into the wood, maroon, partially dried, bordered by faint drag marks. Next to it lay a snapped-off button, torn from what looked to be a blouse, gray, plastic. Forensics bagged both and dusted the corroded doorknob. The most chilling find was a crooked, blood-stained length of pine dowel. One end was splintered, as if from forceful impact. The team swept the floor for DNA, picking up traces of epithelial cells. Prints were hard to come by. Whoever was here last must have worn gloves, but a partial palm print was lifted from the windowsill. A few feet to the left of the door, detectives found a lost earring. A delicate silver hoop, the mate to one found still lodged in Lisa's left ear. When Dr. Carter later matched blood and tissue samples from the cabin to Lisa Tran, a grisly timeline began to take shape. It seemed clear. Lisa Tran's abduction or murder didn't happen on Miller Hill. She was brought here, likely under false pretenses or force, held briefly, then bludgeoned and killed inside this ancient, moldering cabin. Only later did the killer haul her out, perhaps using a tarp, and ferry her the distance to Miller Hill, where her body was hastily interred atop another grave. The search of the cabin turned up more clues, both obvious and subtle. In a corner beneath the mildew, someone had left an empty prescription bottle for a powerful sedative, the label peeled away. On the porch, the impression of a boot print, crusted with the same red Oregon clay as at Miller Hill. In the surrounding brush, another firefighting volunteer found a latex glove torn at the thumb, half buried among the ferns. Investigators mapped the old hunting trails that threaded between cabin and cemetery. With a four-wheel drive vehicle, it was possible to make the run in under 20 minutes, especially under cover of darkness. A determined, organized killer would have seen the opportunity. Isolation, obscurity, clean exits back toward the highway. Detective Bennett connected the dots. Lisa's recent troubles, the anonymous pickup, the cabin and its spilled secrets. Questions haunted the investigation. How had Lisa been lured? Why this cascade of horror? The drugging, the violence, the cruel placement of her body in the old cemetery? Who knew the back roads and the shadows well enough to vanish, leaving behind only fragments of a life and the echo of a crime? Back in Salem, Julia Nguyen was asked about any secrets, any enemies, anyone in Lisa's orbit who wanted her silenced. But nothing surfaced, beyond the faintest hints of a failed relationship, and perhaps, she whispered, someone who never got over the past. In Elmtown, the little town that had never been known for anything at all, people now watched the forest's edge with suspicion. The old cabin was condemned, then locked and sealed, but the fear remained. The local papers called it the Miller Hill Mystery. Everyone, cops, reporters, and neighbors alike, waited for the next clue, the next answer, even as rain continued to fall and secrets seemed to fester in the sodden Oregon woods. Closing in, the net tightens and a suspect emerges. The investigation into Lisa Tran's tragic death gained momentum as April light faded to a damp, muted gray. With her identity confirmed and the grisly timeline, cabin then grave, established, Sheriff Hayes and his team began the tireless work of pulling at every thread that protruded from the frayed fabric of the case. The questions were no longer, what happened, or who was she? Now their focus had shifted to, who did this, and why? Detective Laura Bennett led the effort from the evidence board in the sheriff's office. The walls of the small operations room bristled with maps, timelines, and photographs. The snapshot of Lisa and Julia at an office party, surveillance stills of cars passing cone-shadowed intersections, close-ups of muddy boot prints, post-it notes multiplied. Silver pickup. Male driver. Cabin. C prescription bottle. Sunset menthol cigarette butt. Lab pending. The first tangible break came from the forensics lab across the valley. Within 48 hours, they connected the DNA on the cigarette butt found near Linda Evans's grave to a profile in the state's database, something left over from an old bar fight 2 years ago. The sample came back to an address in Portland. Martin Everson, 38 years old, owner of a small home repair business. He didn't have a violent record, but the confirmation sent a ripple of excitement through the station. Hayes and Bennett knew the name. Everson's mother was Linda Evans, the very woman whose grave Lisa had been violated upon. Laura's curiosity sharpened into suspicion. Why would Martin's DNA be at the gravesite? This isn't just some random perp passing through. And if he's from Portland, why here? Why Miller Hill? They dug further. Phone records revealed Martin had made several calls to a disposable, unlisted number. One also pinged just outside Salem on the early morning. Lisa vanished, then later near Elmtown, and hours later, back on the outskirts of Portland. Detective Bennett checked DMV records. Martin owned a 2011 silver Ford F-150 with tinted windows. Julia, the roommate, confirmed that the truck seen by Mabel Walker outside the gas station matched that description. Armed with probable cause, Hayes dispatched plainclothes officers to observe Martin's home and business in Portland. Meanwhile, the team pored through Martin's recent credit card transactions. The paper trail illuminated a careful, calculating mind. Receipts traced Martin's journey down Route 99, purchases of gas and snacks, cash withdrawals at small ATMs near Miller Hill. Crucially, a hardware store in Salem provided one more lead: a cash purchase of gloves, a folding shovel, a roll of black plastic trash bags, the same kind found torn near the old grave. As pressure mounted, the investigators worked every angle. They canvassed every road leading from Elmtown to Portland, searching for witnesses who remembered Martin's face or his truck's striking custom bumper sticker. Everson Home Repairs, no job too small. The cabin yielded another clue: a partial palm print from the windowsill. Portland PD's print analyst ran it against requested prints from Martin Everson. The pattern in the ridge, a unique scar shaped like a lightning bolt, matched. This detail, combined with lab results confirming Lisa's blood on Martin's boots recovered during a search warrant, formed a damning chain. As their confidence grew, the detectives tried to reconstruct motive. Bank records showed Martin had withdrawn over $2,000 in the days before Lisa disappeared. More than enough for a man with steady work. Was he desperate? Was he trying to cover something up? They searched for any sign of a link between Martin and Lisa, and at first found only shadows: school alumni records, the unlikely fact that both had attended the same state university a decade earlier, but no evidence of social overlap. Then, digging through old photos recovered from Lisa's cloud account, Julia found a candid snapshot: Lisa at a coffee shop, Martin blurry in the background, eyes fixed in her direction. The next blow came via social media. Detective Bennett, posing as a private citizen in a true crime forum, received an anonymous tip. Martin Everson had once stalked a woman from college for months, although no official charges were ever filed. The woman's name was redacted, but 2 years ago she moved to Portland, around the time Linda Evans passed away. A new hypothesis emerged: a secret fixation, perhaps reignited by grief or frustration. Laura and Hayes considered the pattern. Martin's mother dies. He returns home more often. Moods darken. Something is off, in the words of neighbors. Saham. Now, with Lisa gone, Martin's old wounds seemed to have split open into violence. The mounting evidence demanded a confrontation. On a gray April morning, just as the city's traffic began to swell, an unmarked police cruiser pulled into the lot outside Martin's business. Martin was found inside, methodically repairing a broken cabinet, wearing the stoic calm of a man trained to hide turmoil. Sheriff Hayes watched him, noting a tension in Martin's jaw. They took him in quietly. No cuffs, no drawn weapons, just the weight of evidence ushering him into the questioning room of the Marion County Sheriff's Office. "Martin," began Hayes, laying out the photographs methodically. Lisa's portrait, snapshots from the gas station, a close-up of the bloody cabin floor. "We know you were at Miller Hill Cemetery. We know you saw Lisa the day she disappeared. And we know you used your truck to drive her out there." Martin listened, hands clasped tightly, palms white. "That's not possible," he said, but his voice was thin. "I haven't been back there in months." But the evidence was relentless. The boot prints, the DNA trace on the cigarette, the palm print, and the matching tire tracks. When pressed about the cabin, Martin's facade began to crumble. He insisted, at first, that he'd only wanted to talk to Lisa, that he'd been drinking, that everything got out of hand. "This isn't what you think. It got out of control," he mumbled. Detective Bennett kept her tone measured. "How did Lisa end up at your mother's grave, Martin?" "Why here?" He flinched at the mention of his mother, looking away, jaw set hard. "You don't understand. No one does." Later, back in the office, Bennett and Hayes recounted the day's events. The net had narrowed. The lines of evidence converged on Martin Everson. He was held without bail, pending formal charges. Outside, dusk had fallen over Miller Hill. In Elmtown, people locked their doors a little earlier and left porch lights on all night. For now at least, the fear was met with a measure of relief. Justice was in motion, and the forest seemed a little less menacing in its hush of gathering night. Motive and a breathtaking confession. Inside the sterile, windowless interview room, the pressure was palpable. A tension heavy enough to bend the steel chairs and draw beads of sweat on Sheriff Hayes's brow. Martin Everson sat beneath the flickering fluorescent bulb, arms crossed tightly, jaw tense to the point of aching. On the table between them lay silent monuments, fingerprint cards, weathered photos, blood-stained evidence bags. Every scrap pointed to a crime so intimate, so desperate, that even the seasoned officers felt haunted by its implications. Detective Bennett leaned forward, her voice deliberately soft, almost maternal, as she began. "Martin, everyone wants to understand. Why? This doesn't look like the work of a stranger. This isn't random. We need the truth. For Lisa, for your family, for you." Martin squeezed his eyes shut, jaw muscles twitching, hands trembling in his lap. Silence stretched on, punctuated only by the quiet click of the tape recorder. The sheriff's patience was unyielding. They let the pressure cook, minutes ticking by, the weight of Martin's own memories bearing down on him harder with each passing second. Finally, Martin exhaled, long, ragged, exhausted. When he spoke, his voice sounded like it belonged to someone several decades older, hollowed out by regret. "I didn't mean for any of this. I wanted to fix things. I thought if I could talk to her, maybe everything would make sense again." Detective Bennett kept her eyes on Martin, steady as the tide. "Tell us about Lisa." For a moment he hesitated, rubbing a calloused palm against his jeans. "Years ago, before my wife, before the business, I met Lisa on a group trip. Just a couple days hiking, but she was easy to talk to, cheerful, alive in a way I never was. I thought she liked me. She was nice to everyone." He looked up, eyes rimmed with red. "But nothing happened. She moved on. I saw her around, at the university. She had friends. She had plans. I met my wife, started a family, tried to forget Lisa. But then, Mom died, and everything started feeling empty. I went through her things, went back to the old town more and more." "What did seeing Lisa again make you feel?" Bennett pressed gently. "I was angry at the world. My wife and we only had a daughter. My mother always wanted a grandson, always talked about carrying on the Everson name. It was stupid, but after she died, I felt like I'd failed. And Lisa, she was a memory of something I never did right. I thought if I could get her to understand, to, maybe, try again, I could fix what was broken inside me." Martin described how he'd reached out to Lisa, how she refused his increasingly desperate messages. In a fit of obsession, he discovered through old emails that Lisa worked in Salem and was between jobs. He waited near her apartment, convinced himself it was fate, not stalking. On April 6th, he texted from a burner phone and played on her sense of decency. She agreed to meet early, said she just wanted to talk. I drove the pickup. She was nervous, but got in after I told her it was just coffee, a chance to apologize. His voice broke at the next part. "We drove, and I parked near that hunting cabin. It was raining. I offered her coffee I'd bought on the way. I put something in it. I shouldn't have. I only wanted her to listen. But she got scared, tried to run. There was a stick, a dowel, by the door. I blocked her path, tried to stop her. She kept screaming, saying I was crazy, that she'd call the cops. I swung the stick. I don't even remember the moment, the sound, just when I opened my eyes, she was gone." He described moving Lisa's body, the panicked hours that followed. I thought about leaving her there, but the rain, the mud. I kept thinking about Mom's grave. Nobody ever visits Miller Hill. I thought it was the safest place nobody would look. I stole a shovel and wrapped Lisa in a tarp, drove at night, used the side road. Nobody saw me. Martin's confession came in fits and starts. The desperate drive in the rain, the struggle to carry Lisa's small body alone, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped her in the open grave. He explained, with hollow resignation, how he'd tried to bury her atop his mother, believing absurdly, in some twisted way, it would keep the secret safe, close to family, insulated by old sorrows. But fear of identification stalked him even as he threw each shovelful of dirt. She had this tiny burn scar on her finger. I remembered from years ago. I thought, maybe if they couldn't find that, no one would know. I used my knife. I just wanted to hide what I'd done. His voice dropped to a whisper. Nothing worked. The smell, the fear, I could never hide from it. The room was utterly silent when he finished, save for low cries muffled by a trembling fist. Detective Bennett stopped the tape and nodded to Sheriff Hayes, who quietly left to summon the prosecutor. There was little left to say. The evidence, combined with Martin's confession, fit every macabre detail. Martin was left alone for a few moments, the weight of his own words sinking in. His shoulders hunched, eyes empty, he seemed to shrink into the chair as echoes of his confession drifted through the room. On the other side of the two-way glass, a somber silence hung over the investigative team. It was never just about evidence and procedure. These were the moments that tested the humanity of even the most veteran detectives. Detective Bennett quietly reviewed the audio recording, cataloging the strange blend of remorse, self-pity, and confusion in Martin's lengthy admission. Hayes, meanwhile, called in the district attorney and a court-appointed defense lawyer. Within an hour, the official paperwork was underway. Charges of first-degree murder and desecration of a grave, among others. Bennett continued to gently question Martin, seeking clarification and motive, not for the conviction, the evidence was overwhelming, but for closure. "What would you want Lisa's family to understand?" she asked. Martin wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "I can't ask them to forgive me. I shouldn't have tried to fix my own pain by dragging someone else through it. I lost myself. I deserve whatever's coming." Outside, rain beat against the station windows. The town of Elmtown, traumatized by weeks of rumors and fear, began to process the truth. Lisa Tran's name was spoken in reverent tones, sorrow hovering in every conversation at church suppers, in the aisles of the grocery store, and at kitchen tables stained by sleepless nights. Julia Nguyen, Lisa's closest friend and roommate, sat across from Detective Bennett, racked by complicated grief, anger, regret, heartbreak, and a faint, cold relief that Lisa's fate was no longer a mystery. The investigation team compiled a full timeline for the prosecutor, from Martin's stalking online and in person, the cheap burner phone purchase, the journey to Salem at dawn, and the stop at the gas station witnessed by Mabel Walker. They included the forensics, Lisa's DNA in the cabin, Martin's skin under her nails, the distinct boot tread in cabin and grave alike, the prescription sedatives, the partial palm print, and the fibers caught in the folds of the tarp. Every piece fleshed out the narrative Martin had finally confessed to, closing the circuit between grief, obsession, and a terrible misspent yearning to solve the riddle of his own past failures. Interviews with Martin's wife revealed the silent changes at home, unexplained absences, bursts of irritation, late nights spent in the garage. She'd noticed him growing distant since his mother's death, but nothing, no sign, would have prepared her for this. The revelation detonated across Everson's tight family network. Cousins stunned into silence, aunts weeping openly during interviews. Many residents of Elmtown only realized in that moment how little they knew about the lives and wounds that shaped those closest to them. The legal machinery rolled forward, swift for a case so severe. At the courthouse, a packed gallery of press and townsfolk gathered for Martin's arraignment. He was led into the courtroom in a wrinkled orange jumpsuit, cuffs biting at his wrists, gaze fixed on the floor. The judge read the charges: murder, aggravated assault, unlawful disposal of a corpse, tampering with evidence. And Martin replied with a cracked, solemn, "Guilty." Neighbors in Elmtown watched the proceedings live on grainy television screens, conversations tinged with sorrow and disbelief. Nobody could recall such evil in their midst, not one that had lain hidden so close beneath the thin veneer of their peaceful town. For many, the most chilling question was not just how Lisa died, but how easily Martin had hidden his darkness, how closely horror had brushed against the fabric of their ordinary days. Detective Bennett and Sheriff Hayes stood outside the courthouse after the verdict, taking in the hush of a rare late sunbeam after a week of rain. The chief addressed the press. "We are heartbroken for Lisa Tran and her family. Let this be a reminder. No secret stays buried forever. Justice, while slow sometimes, will always prevail, especially when a community joins together against the emptiness of violence." For the investigators, closure came not in the gavel's bang, but in the quieter moments, the steadying hand placed on Julia Nguyen's shoulder, the wilted bouquets of lilies gathered at Linda Evans's grave, now a place of mourning for both women. The knowledge that, despite the darkness, truth still found its way into the open. Detective Bennett lingered at the cemetery one final time, her boots pressing into damp earth, remembering Lisa's smile in the photograph Julia carried everywhere. She left a slip of note atop both graves: "You are seen. You are remembered." Martin Everson was transferred to a state penitentiary while sentencing awaited. He was ultimately isolated from the world he'd tried to erase and from the people who could not understand him. Elmtown slowly stitched itself together in the aftermath, not forgetting, but growing stronger in its knowing that sometimes even the most ordinary lives can brush with unthinkable tragedy and come through forever changed. Thus, the final keystroke in the Miller Hill tragedy was not vengeance, nor even forgiveness, but bearing witness and honoring what was lost. As spring finally warmed the last silent corners of the little town, the woods held no more secrets, only the soft green promise of renewal, and, above all, the quiet certainty that the truth matters. Closing the case, law and justice. The legal aftermath of the Miller Hill tragedy echoed through Elmtown and beyond, far outlasting the camera crews and hushed shock that had clung to townsfolk like a second skin. As Martin Everson awaited trial in the cold confines of the Marion County Detention Center, his story became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered in every Oregon kitchen, on playground benches, and in the low-lit pews of long-suffering churches. Justice, slow, solemn, and irrevocable, unfolded as the law closed in around him with the same methodical certainty that had peeled away his secrets. Within weeks, the district attorney filed a host of charges: first-degree murder, aggravated assault, desecration of a corpse, obstruction of justice, unlawful disposal of a body, and evidence tampering. The chain of evidence was airtight: the confession, the DNA, the matching prints, and the heartbreakingly detailed forensic record. Martin's court-appointed defense tried to challenge the prosecution by citing his emotional instability and the aftershocks of unchecked grief. Yet the case's monstrous cruelty blunted any efforts at mitigation. He had, after all, led Lisa Tran to her end through a maze of obsession and pain, attempting to hide the act by burying her atop his mother's grave, an act that struck even the most stoic jurors as irredeemably callous. The trial itself was a crucible for the community. In the stark courtroom, under buzzing fluorescent lights, Friends of Lisa, grieving relatives, and even curious townsfolk filled the benches. News vans camped outside the courthouse steps as reporters jostled for quotes and sketches of Martin, whose blank expression and sunken eyes haunted the front page of the local chronicle for weeks. Julia Nguyen, Lisa's best friend and tireless advocate, gave a tearful testimony, painting a portrait of a life interrupted, her dreams, her generosity, her absolute trust. The prosecution returned again and again to the calculated cruelty of the crime, reminding the jury that closure couldn't resurrect what was lost. Tensions flared as Martin took the stand against the advice of his lawyer. His testimony ranged from flat denials to fits of weeping regret. He admitted to following Lisa, to hatching a scheme born of loneliness and spiraling grief after his mother's death. Yet, as the prosecutor pressed him, Martin's answers twisted between self-pity and terrifying frankness. "I tried to fix myself by making her see me. I didn't think about what I was taking from her." The room felt colder for it. In her closing arguments, the DA left the jury with a chilling rhetorical question. If justice means reclaiming the dignity of the lost, then what price is too great for ignoring the humanity of others? It took the jury less than a day to return a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase delivered more than the weight of legal justice. It gave the Tran family, and by extension the whole town, a measure of peace. The judge, voice trembling only slightly, sentenced Martin Everson to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Your choices robbed a family, a town, even your own kin of their future. The law can only close the wound. You must carry the scar. Tears broke loose in the courtroom, some for Lisa, some for Martin's family, most from the yawning sense of what could never be repaired. For Elmtown, the court's verdict was both punishment and healing. In the months that followed, neighbors held candlelit vigils near Miller Hill Cemetery. Volunteers restored and protected the grounds, planting wildflowers and installing a granite bench beneath the old oaks. Lisa's story, and the hard-won victory of truth over silence, led to a scholarship at the university she once attended. Reports of strangers waned. Town meetings grew a little longer, with more volunteering, more open space for grief, and less room for secrets to fester in shadows. Martin's absence created a void for his remaining family, many of whom barely recognized the man the papers detailed in dark, lurid ink. They too grieved, not just for Lisa, but for the atrocities a loved one could commit beneath layers of isolation and denial. Local clergy and counselors opened their arms to everyone touched by the ripple of tragedy, and for the first time in years, Elmtown's churches were full. Detective Laura Bennett and Sheriff Hayes, exhausted but resolved, filed away the last of the evidence on a late summer afternoon. When justice works, Hayes mused, it doesn't fill the emptiness, but maybe it keeps the darkness from spreading. Years later, visitors still left notes and bouquets at Linda Evans's and Lisa Tran's joined resting place. Children played at the edge of the woods again, and the town stitched its identity back together, bearing scars with courage, honoring the memory of those lost. In a quiet, ongoing way, the lessons of the Miller Hill case lived on. That justice is sometimes a lonely climb, but that truth matters, and peace can truly grow where honesty, community, and compassion finally take root.